Hi everybody, welcome to Embercombe Online. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes while everybody gets into the room. We've got quite a few people coming in tonight, and we're also live streaming on Facebook. Lovely to see some familiar faces. Can you let us know, Nusha, when everyone's in? If everybody can just make sure they're muted, please, just so we don't get any background noise. Great, I think that's pretty much everyone. Fantastic, thank you, thanks Nusha. Yeah, welcome to tonight. We're going to talk about psychedelics. It's a subject that we're really excited about. At Embercombe, we're really interested in nature connection, and there has been a lot of talk lately about the possibility of psychedelics as a tool to make us feel more connected to the wider world, to nature, to each other, ultimately to ourselves. So we were really delighted last year when the Imperial College researchers came to do an integration weekend at Embercombe, inviting people that had had experience with psychedelics come and share some of their experiences in our natural environment. So we're really delighted to have those researchers here tonight, Ros Watts and Sam Gandhi, and we'd really love them to talk a little bit about their work at Imperial and the new work that they're involved in and what it means for connection to nature generally. So I am going to hand over to them. What we'll do is speak for about 40 minutes, something like that, and then open it up for questions. If you want to put things in the chat, then Nusha, our host for this evening, will pick up anything you pop in there, any questions that you might have as we go along. We may not be able to include all of them because sometimes they come quite quickly, but you're welcome to do that. I mean, no further ado then, Ros and Sam, welcome so much. If you can unmute yourselves, that'd be fantastic. Could you tell us a bit about your work in general? And I'm sure a lot of people have heard about the Imperial College trials. Would you just like to say a little something on what those were about?
Yes, thank you, Rachel. And it's so nice to be here because we do have, such nice memories of being at Embercombe, and I can't wait to go back there. We are actually supposed to be having another integration workshop at Embercombe recently, which we had to not do really because of COVID. But yes, I can't wait to be back there again amongst those amazing trees. So I'm Ros, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've actually just now left, but I was at Imperial College for over 5 years, nearly 6 maybe, at the Imperial College Centre for Psychedelic Research. And during my time there, I worked on two trials that both looked at the use of psilocybin for depression. So that was synthetic psilocybin. And people in our study came in and they had 2 sessions, and that's a full day experience with psilocybin, with 2 therapists with them all day in a hospital room that we made to kind of look as much like a forest as we could, with pictures of trees, although obviously not quite as good as the real thing. And people listened to a playlist. The music's a really important part of it. And they had headphones on, listening to the music, eye shades on as well. And they spent 2 days going deep into their inner worlds, as psychedelics can help people do. and then some support with therapists beforehand and afterwards as well. And what we found is that psilocybin does seem to, for many people, not for everybody, but for many people, it does seem to deactivate the brain networks that can become very over rigid in depression. And not just in depression, but with us generally. It's really it deactivates a network of brain systems called the default mode network. And the default mode network is the biological basis of the sense of self, or ego. So when people, you might have heard people talk about psychedelics as deactivating the ego, and that is essentially what they do. So there's this temporary disruption of those systems, and it brings about a sense of openness to people. It's sometimes quite temporary, it doesn't last forever, but there's this burst of openness and flexibility. And people describe in the weeks afterwards, usually, again, not everybody, a feeling of going from a sense of being very disconnected and very shut off, and very shut down, to feeling like they're more able to connect to themselves. So connect to their deeper self, not just the ego mind, but the deeper self, all the parts of themselves, and to connect to other people more, and to connect to the wider world. And that obviously includes nature. So because of those findings, so Sam and I are working together now on a project which we'll talk about in a bit at Synthesis, really looking at that connectedness that can come about, especially the connectedness to nature, and developing a therapy program which is meant to really amplify and give space for that connectedness. So nature connectedness is part of the whole therapy program. So that's an overview of the studies and the main findings. I mean, just one more thing to say before I pass over to Sam. As the kind of the connectedness findings was in a way like a kind of a secondary finding. The main thing we were looking at in the studies was, well, two things: brain scans, and also we were looking at people's scores on depression measures. And in terms of the depression scores, what we found is that for most people having a psilocybin experience, people would experience relief from depression for approximately kind of 2 to 3 months, but then their depression would come back. So it's not a panacea, it's not a cure-all, but it does seem to offer this sense of flexibility and openness. And it's not without its challenges. So this kind of opening up and this new sense of sensitivity and openness brings about, it has some complications as well. If someone's been shut down for a very long period of time, and then they have this burst of creativity and openness, and suddenly feeling emotions they haven't felt for a long time, and being more sensitive to their senses and their emotions, it can be very overwhelming. So it's not like a simple kind of magic cure at all. It's really an opening up people to a new way of seeing things and seeing themselves and each other, which can be really quite intense for people, and so requires a lot of integration. And that's what we did at Embercombe. We had these integration workshops to try and build a community around this work, so that people weren't just having an experience and then going back to normal life, but meeting other people that have been through these kind of things and communicating with them and working together to maintain this connectedness and also integrate it into normal life. So yeah, so the connectedness is one side of it, but then also just looking at the depression scores is another side of it. And yeah, we're at the very beginning of this kind of research. So we're now at the stage of realizing that yes, it's safe when it's done in these research studies, and there's lots of potential. And now we're at the stage of thinking, now we're starting to optimize it and think how we can develop it. And that's really where Sam comes in. So Sam is an ecologist. I'll pass over to him, and he's working with us to look specifically at the potential of psychedelics to enhance nature connectedness.
Thank you, Ros. Yeah, hello everybody. So yes, so part of Ros's work was looking at connectedness, where she kind of discovered the link between connectedness and people's mental health improving. It's one of the key things that psilocybin seems to do fairly reliably. And so on one slice of that connectedness is connectedness to nature. And I'm sure, like most people listening to this, are kind of aware what that might entail, but just so we're all on the same page, because it means something quite specific. Nature connectedness can be defined as a sense of oneness with the natural world, or a definition I particularly like, a sustained awareness of the interrelatedness between oneself and the rest of nature. So your self-identification with the natural world, the degree to how you see yourself as part of it. And so part of my research collaboration at Imperial, I was part of a prospective survey study looking at naturalistic psychedelic usage. So people doing it in their own terms, in the wild, so to speak, or as part of retreats, such as Synthesis. I think a lot of the data actually came from psilocybin truffle sessions at Synthesis. And we sort of, people were assessed prior to their psychedelic experience, and then at two week, 4 week, and I think then 2 year follow-up. So we had these kind of this before, after, and then long-term snapshots of where people were on all different measures, but we were looking specifically at nature relatedness, which is a sort of another word essentially for nature connectedness. And we found a few interesting things. We first found this very strong, very clear relationship between people's total lifetime psychedelic usage and their baseline levels of nature relatedness. And there was a very sort of clear link between those things. We also found that for people who were psychedelic naive, so people who had no prior psychedelic experience, they also showed an increase after just one session in their nature relatedness. There was a long-term, these shifts in nature relatedness were sustained and enduring as well, and they were strongly associated with this concomitant increase in psychological well-being as well. We found that the perceived, like access to and the perceived importance to natural settings during the acute psychedelic experience were predictive of increases in nature relatedness, particularly in people who rated lower in it, interestingly. And we also found that experiences of ego dissolution, so when the sense of self and the default mode network of the brain sort of dissolve, and there's this perceived dissolution between self and other, or self and nature. So the boundaries, that usually divide us from the rest of the world become very blurry, and that perspective shift that can sort of come with that can be quite a profound experience for people. So, and I just want to get across how important and potentially interesting this is. So this builds on from a few previous studies that have found a link between psychedelic use and nature relatedness. So just to compare, there's been the literature kind of reports a range of things. So some studies show that simple passive contact with nature can increase nature connectedness. Other studies suggest that this is fleeting and transient, and then it comes back down quite quickly. Still, other studies, multiple studies, show that no, passive contact with nature is not enough to increase nature connectedness. It seems it requires more active emotional participation in nature to increase it. So, and just to put this in perspective, one study looked at like a long-term heavy dose of nature intervention. So people spent half an hour a day in nature for 30 days, and their sort of their mental well-being and their mindfulness scores were looked at after this time. And there was this, as you might expect, it affected their mental health and their mindfulness positively. But their nature connectedness was looked at, and there was no change in that. Despite all that time in nature for that long, there was no change in their nature connectedness. Then we compare it to some of the psychedelic research that's happened. People are being administered a single or a few doses of this synthetic but natural psychedelic drug in a clinical setting that's lacking in nature, and there is this fairly immediate and sustained robust shift in their nature connectedness measures. And that to me is fascinating, because it's happening in spite of the setting. And the rest of the research literature on nature connectedness shows that if you're going to increase nature connectedness, it very much hinges on being in nature and engaging with it in some way. So the fact that this is possible without that is deeply mysterious, compelling, and exciting, I think. And it then makes me wonder, well, if psychedelics have this capacity anyway that seems to be inherent, imagine if we purposely use them as nature connecting agents at all stages. So preparation, session itself, follow-up integration. There's so much potential here. And I guess that kind of follows on to what I'm doing now, partly with Ros at Synthesis. I'm helping as part of the clinical arm of the Synthesis Institute that's opened up. We
should maybe describe what it is, Sam, before we should maybe describe about the Synthesis Therapy Program before you talk about nature.
Cool.
Just so that it's kind of clear what the new project.
Sure.
Should we see if anyone has any questions around the research before we move on to the new project?
Yeah. I mean, I've got a couple of questions, and there's more kind of coming up here. There was a question about playlists, which I think has been answered a few times. Kind of, it seems like that you talked about the playlists were really important. Kind of, was that music that people chose for themselves, or was it selected by yourselves? How did that come into it?
Yeah, so I've actually put the playlist on there on the chat.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
And that was selected by you then, or was that with kind of interaction from anyone else?
No, so that's the playlist that I made is everybody had the same playlist for the research. We needed to keep it constant, and yeah, all the research uses playlists so that everybody has the same music. The music's so important. You have to have music. It would be pretty unethical, I think, to ask someone to have a psilocybin experience without music. It would just be very, very difficult. Even in the pauses between songs, people sometimes describe kind of feeling a bit like in free fall. The music becomes like a handrail and really forms the experience. And so we have the same playlist for everybody, and the playlist is one that includes, it's there in a Spotify link. It includes some classical music, some kind of I would say classical music, some ambient music, some Indian music, some quite spiritual music, and some nature sounds and nature music. And all psychedelic playlists follow a kind of peak, a particular rhythm. So they have this peak at the beginning when the people first have the psychedelic, the psilocybin. Their experience kind of ramps up for the first hour or so. It can feel like taking off. It can feel quite kind of like turbulent. So the music needs to have a chug and an energy and a force behind it to help people with the kind of lift off and breakthrough. And then it becomes more gentle. And because people in our studies are coming because they're suffering from depression, the music that we play is quite kind of bittersweet. It's quite, in a way, heart-rending to help the expression of the emotion and to help people to explore those feelings, the pain and grief and those things. The music can help them go there. So there's this kind of breakthrough arc at the beginning, and then much more expansive, bittersweet, quite beautiful but quite poignant music after that.
Fantastic. I wonder if anybody else would like to ask a question. Do you want to raise your hand electronically? Nusha, can you quickly explain how to do that?
So there should be a tab under participants where you can.
There's a lot of. Do you want me? There's quite a few questions going on. Do you want me to run through a few?
Yeah. Or if you want to go for it, Sam. Yeah, we've got a lot going on all over the screen at the moment. But yeah, if you want to do that, it's great.
Okay, I'm happy to, because there's a build-up of questions here. So a truffle retreat. So truffle, it's a form of certain species of fungus in the Psilocybe mexicana species clade, form these sclerotia. They form lumps of mycelium, like potatoes form tubers in a similar fashion. It's kind of a storage device for the fungus to get it through hard times. And it's legal because of the silly laws. It's legal, completely legal in the, not silly, but good silly laws, completely legal to ingest those in the Netherlands. So that's all legal and above board, as is ingesting the mycelium we've discovered, but that's a separate tale for another time. So yes, the study that I was talking about with involving doses of nature, and I'm sorry it's a crude, I know it's a bit of a crude way to term it, that was a non-psychedelic study of people having a half an hour of nature contact for 30 days. I was just comparing it to the effect of psychedelics on nature connectedness. Let's see. So yes, how nature connectedness is measured. That's a good, important question. So there's quite a few different scales used, and we used one called the NR6, the Nature Relatedness 6 scale, which is a short version of the NR 21 scale. And it's effectively like, it's 6 items where you're graded on your relationship, your connection to, your emotional affinity to, and your care for nature. And you're graded on essentially like a 1 to 5 scale. And yes, and then the total mean is taken of that. So it sounds a little bit crude, but it's kind of, you can't really do heavy mechanistic neuroscience to look at this. You know, the only way you can find out about this is to ask people. But I don't want the sort of seeming crudeness of it to sort of get in the way of the power of it, because nature connected, there's a very strong research base to show its link between the nature relatedness and mental health and well-being, but also it's strong enough to affect behavior. So people who rate high in nature connectedness tend to be more pro-environmentally active and interested and aware. And qualitative research can be very powerful as well. Like with Ros's research, it was her discovery of the link between mental health gains and connectedness, or part of the mechanism that psilocybin seemed to be working was simply through asking people. And you couldn't get that through doing just neuroscience alone. So it does have a very important part to play.
Can I just cut in there for a second, Sam? I mean,
sure.
With the state of the world as it is at the moment, you know, I guess a lot of people would be thinking, you know, well, actually microdoses of psilocybin or other plant medicines may be the way forward for people to become more connected and then take more action in their own lives. I mean, what's your feeling about that?
One thing I would immediately just flag with that, and I'm not in any way trying to sort of shut that down, but we know from the research that these, at least with regard to enduring, sustained shifts in people's perspectives and nature connectedness, it's coming about through the big, deep experiences. So where people's egos dissolve, and these are strongly correlated with the mystical type peak experiences, the deep spiritual experiences people have under psilocybin and psychedelics are closely associated with the ego powering down. Essentially, you're getting out of the way of yourself. And so that kind of experience, both studies, retrospective studies looking back, and our prospective research kind of looking back and then after the event, have shown this link between ego dissolution and nature relatedness. So you're not going to experience that on a microdose. A microdose certainly may tune you in and make you more aware and sort of present and sort of aesthetically in tune, but it's not going to cause a lasting change in your relationship to nature, I don't think.
Okay, and kind of a question to you then, Ros. I mean, so you're saying that it's not straightforward. I mean, I'm sure anybody that has had experience of psychedelics knows that it can also go wrong in the wrong kind of circumstances as well. So if it was to take a big dose to make people feel connected and to make big changes in their kind of relationship with the world and what they then went on to do, I'm assuming there are problems with that. It would have to be under very carefully controlled circumstances. I mean, what's your feeling on that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing we're learning more as we carry on with this research is just how complicated it is. And I think when we did the first study, I did some qualitative research with people 6 months after their psilocybin experience, people with depression, and the interviews, the qualitative data from those interviews, people said things like, oh, it was like somebody defragged my brain, or it was like a total reset, or yeah, like a brain reset, and things like that, and some really amazing, inspiring quotes. And so we included some of those in presentations, and then sometimes the media presented those quotes in kind of headlines like, you know, psilocybin resets the brain. And I still see headlines about things like this now, and I always kick myself for allowing those quotes to get out there in that way, because that's just one part of it. And sometimes it might feel for people like it is this amazing reset, but there's such a range of experiences. And the thing I see more and more and more is just how sensitive people can be afterwards, that this opening up is really sensitive. So I mean, there's a whole load of different complications. The first one is, right from one side of things, it doesn't always work for people. You can resist it, like a really high dose of psilocybin, you can resist it. You can, psychological resistance can counteract the effects of psilocybin. So sometimes people feel nothing, or they don't feel anything very strong, and then they're very disappointed. And that's actually quite common. Sometimes people, it's just disappointing. It's not what they imagined. They saw stuff in the headlines about it being this mystical experience, or feeling all this connection, and then it just doesn't really feel that. Often it's it can be very autobiographical. You can be really stuck in emotions and feelings, and sometimes it's very murky, and you know, it doesn't feel very wonderful or mystical or connected at all. It just feels kind of murky and grim and difficult, and there's always learning in it, but it's not always expansive. It doesn't always feel expansive at the time. It can feel very trapped and very, very uncomfortable. And then when people do have really big, intense experiences, it can feel like a rebirth, and then afterwards people feel very thin-skinned, like a newborn baby out in the world, and the world can feel very overwhelming. People also feel a bit more anxious afterwards. So we've seen that it's really good for depression, but it seems to actually sometimes, it doesn't seem to lessen anxiety, and sometimes it can make anxiety worse afterwards. I think it's because, yeah, people have described being quite shut down for a long time in depression, then suddenly they're just a bit more kind of up and down and inside out and all over the place. So people can feel quite sensitive and all over the place. So yeah, it's complicated. And I mean, that's in the research setting where there's therapists that have been trained to do the work, and we have protocols. And I mean, when people do this kind of thing recreationally, it's a whole different story. Michelle Baker-Jones and I ran an integration group in London for people not in it, well, could be in the research studies, but just for people that were using psilocybin or other ayahuasca or LSD for therapeutic purposes in retreats or wherever. And there were just so many people that would come to these groups talking about using these on their own or in retreats or at festivals, and having these experiences they just did not know how to integrate, and people could be haunted by them for years. So they're incredibly powerful, and we still don't really understand them. We still don't really understand how they're working.
And have you seen with the research whether there are any particular conditions that make it difficult for people, or are there particular kind of sensitivities, or the particular people that shouldn't, you know? Have you got any
yes,
research on that?
Very important question. Yeah, it's something that we actually often don't talk about enough, and it's so important to say. So the exclusion criteria that we have in the research is probably, well, maybe it's a little bit, I mean, it definitely errs on the side of caution, because we have to protect the research as well as individuals. And you know, when I say protect the research, I mean, you know, there was lots of research done on psilocybin and LSD in the 40s when it was first synthesized and discovered and researched by psychologists and psychiatrists. There was lots of research showing it was very effective. Something 40,000 patients treated with it in their 40s, 50s and 60s, and then it was banned. So we're very aware that it wouldn't take very much for something like that to happen again, and the research to be derailed again like it was before. So we're very cautious to prevent that from happening. And the kind of thing that would derail it would be if somebody, for example, in one of our studies had a serious psychotic break, and that is always on our mind, is something that we're worried about. So we don't allow people to participate if they have psychosis or any experiences of psychosis or schizophrenia or drug-induced psychosis or delusional thoughts or anything like that, or hearing voices, or anybody in their family, a close family member with any of those things, or with bipolar disorder 1 or 2, or mania. And that's not to say that psychedelics would not help anybody with any of those things. We don't know. We've heard stories of people that have had those things and say psychedelics have helped them. It's just that in the research now we have to be really cautious, because people with those kind of vulnerabilities might be more likely to have a psychotic response, like a psychotic break after a psychedelic experience. We also, there's more exclusion criteria, but yeah, I mean, you get the picture. It's kind of psychiatric conditions.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And I mean, I guess there are a lot of people kind of that have had these experiences at festivals or, you know, recreational using then. So it kind of does bring us to this idea about integration then. And certainly when you came to Embercombe, it was for people that had done the trials, but also wider, you know, anybody out there that feels that, you know, there is still integration work to do. And I wondered if you could say more about that integration, what it looks like, you know, even how people can do that for themselves, because of course not everybody can come to an integration weekend or something, but yeah, what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, well, integration is, I think in a way it's something that you kind of need to do it with someone else. I think it's very hard to do alone, but you could do it with a therapist. So there's lots of, obviously in COVID, everyone's working online. So there's loads of good psychedelic integration therapists. There's a website called TRIPP, TRIPP. It has a list of psychedelic therapists that do integration work. There are integrations, all the integration circles are now happening on Zoom as well. The Psychedelic Integration Group happens on Zoom. But I guess Sam would probably have some ideas about integrating experiences in nature, which I think is actually probably the best. Like, we always say to people in this, well, not always, but often in the study afterwards, we would say, I mean, it's such a hippie cliche, but we'd say, you know, go and hug a tree, because actually, genuinely, hugging a tree after an experience like that is like plugging you into the life force that you experienced. So yeah, Sam, nature practices for integrating.
So yeah, there's quite a few different potential options here. One idea that Ros came up with is obviously horticultural therapy is sort of gaining traction in recent years, and like her ideas for a few practices I thought were really good. So before your session, you could kind of tend the soil, prepare the soil on a patch, and then sort of post session you could plant a seed, and then take that with you, because obviously a big part of your integration is to kind of process, make sense, and hold on to the insights that arise during a psychedelic session, to sort of take back. It's like gold panning. It's like mental gold panning, and you've got a lot of stuff to sift through, and there's little glints of real gold in there, but it's sort of like that sand is going through your fingers. You've not got a proper pan, so you've got to like try and ground them and embed them in your life, in your psyche. And I really like that Ros's idea of planting a seed that you then nurture and water as you're kind of nurturing those new perspectives, those insights in yourself. I think that's a nice thing, while also connecting you to nature in that fundamental way. Shinrin Yoku practices, that's something we did at Embercombe actually at the weekend. We all went into the woods and did some forest bathing, and that seemed to go really, really well. It was really nice seeing how people kind of relaxed and had fun with it and sort of de-stressed, including Ros and Midge, who were kind of obviously running the show. Shinrin Yoku's good in the sense it's essentially it's getting you basically to slow down and tune into the woodland environment with your various senses. So it's an active mindfulness practice in nature. So you're getting, obviously, mindfulness has its own benefits, but you're getting the benefits of being in a natural environment, having inhaling those volatile tree oils, seeing all that greenery in those trees. So you get kind of like a nice entourage effect of all those things. There's research as well, a study out recently showing a very simple but powerful intervention, going on awe walks. So this study simply looked at people went out on a weekly 15-minute walk, and it was over an 8-week period. And they simply, while walking, they were kind of instructed to sort of tap into their childlike sense of wonder at the world and seek out experiences that evoke awe. So each walk would be somewhere new, because novelty and awe kind of go together, but people would be, seeking out things that would invoke those feelings of awe. And we know from the psychedelic research that feelings of awe and connectedness persist beyond the acute effects. So I think we could be doing, and awe and connectedness both are associated with many positive mental health benefits and psychological well-being measures. So we could be doing more, I think, to kind of consolidate the feelings of connectedness and awe that arise following these sessions. We also know that taking the time to acknowledge nature increases connectedness, not just to it, but to yourself and to other people and the world at large. It's a pathway to broad psychological connectedness increase, which is also a big part of how psilocybin seems to work. So that is exciting, because it's like, we know from the research that, as Ros was mentioning, that people's depression scores, they can have some really quite profound benefits and effects, but after, say, 3 months or something, like for some people, their depression scores might start to creep up again. So I think we need to be doing more to sort of, if we can use psilocybin as a tool to kind of facilitate this meaningful connection with nature, then it's this amazing and hugely underutilized health buffering, health promoting resource. So that people, if they have that connection, as has been observed actually with outdoor therapy, which is a kind of growing field, like going outside with people. So you'll have a walk with your therapist and have walk and talk therapy. And one of the benefits of outdoor therapy, as well as putting you on a level playing field with your therapist, is you get to be outside in nature. And through a course of outdoor therapy, it can establish a link to the outdoors, to nature. And then the person undergoing the therapy has this space that they can then use to self-soothe. So the natural outdoor environment itself becomes part of the therapeutic container. And you're not going to get that in a clinical room. So yes, there's quite a few different practices we can build in. And just one quickly want to mention, we know from Johns Hopkins and the research there, they looked at the effect of psilocybin plus spiritual practices. What happens if people are sort of practicing spiritual practices prior and post their psychedelic session? So people did things like mindfulness meditation and journaling as well, with a kind of emotive spiritual sort of focus. And they started, I think, a month before their big psilocybin session. And what was found was that the long-term benefits, the therapeutic gains, were amplified quite markedly by the people who are engaging with the spiritual practices compared to the people who just had the psilocybin session. And this is a big part of how psychedelics work. They are non-specific psychic amplifiers. So that's why they seem to go well partly with the therapy, is that they're amplifying that therapeutic process. So a very simple, one of the interventions here was the act of journaling. And journaling's already been researched as a therapeutic modality on its own. And it was certainly effective in this case, but one of the sort of more robust nature connectedness enhancing measures, according to a study published a few years ago, was this practice called 3 Good Things in Nature. And essentially the intervention in this particular study was for 5 days, you would record in the form of a sentence 3 things a day about nature that you enjoyed or loved or cherished. And what it resulted in was this sort of robust and sustained increase in people's nature connectedness that was evident still 2 months after the 5-week intervention. Now, interestingly, the control group in this study, they recorded factual things about nature, and there was no change. So this is important because it shows that the nature connectedness primarily is not something rational and deliberation based. It's emotional, experiential, and personal, as psychedelics are in their experiential sort of domain. So I feel like, yes, there's a number of practices, quite simple but powerful practices we can build in, we can incorporate here on each side of the psychedelic session. And I hope that as well in the future, that the psychedelic centers of the future will hopefully be centered more in nature. Like Ros and I had this idea of a futuristic sort of, because the clinical setting is very much the focus now, and there's good reasons for that. It keeps people safe and secure, and it's controlled, you know. So that they're all good things for when people are in a highly vulnerable state, as they are with psychedelics. But what about how I think we could have the best of both worlds? So we could have a secure clinical space, but we could incorporate a lot more nature and plants and things into that space. We could have it in somewhere in a woodland setting, say, and have nice glass sort of nice big glass windows and a skylight, say, where you could see the stars, and then you could kind of titrate the levels of nature people are immersed in at various stages of the session based on their needs and wants. And I personally am very interested. We know psychedelics, one of the fundamental mechanisms, they induce powerful experiences of awe. Some research came out of Yale recently looking at nature immersion for sufferers, military veterans with severe PTSD. And it found that time, it's something, you know, the PTSD is quite hard to treat because the brain has essentially rewired itself. But something seemingly as simple as a bit of time in nature, prolonged immersion in nature, can rewire the brain in a powerful way. And this research from Yale found that of all the things tied to being in nature, it was the experience of awe that was the central mechanism by which improvements in PTSD symptoms were happening. So I wonder about awe therapy, where the point of the therapy is to induce awe, because awe, I think, is a key mechanism that is rewiring the brain and eliciting neuroplasticity. So we could use psychedelics in combination with nature immersion as a potent awe-inducing intervention, basically, and that could potentially be beneficial for people.
Fantastic. Awe therapy. I think we must all take that home with us. I'd really love to open it up to live questions in a minute. I had 2 things that I desperately wanted to mention quickly, so I don't even know whether you'll have time to answer them. But I'm thinking of kind of plant medicine and the plants of our own countries. You know, we saw a question a bit earlier about why have you gone for synthetic rather than organic, you know, and I'm also thinking about the music and the chanting, and it feels in a lot of our countries we've lost that connection with how these substances would have been originally used. You know, do you have any super quick thoughts about that, and have you taken that into account with the work that you've done?
Well, I mean, do you want to shoot, Ros?
So the new program, we haven't really talked very much about it, but the new program we've developed at Synthesis is a year-long program based on, well, it's based around Celtic spirituality. It's based on trying to rediscover and build some sense of an indigenous tradition to the UK around the use of plants and the use of nature and the use of groups and ceremony and ritual. So yeah, that's what we're trying to do. And it's also using truffles. So the retreats themselves are in the Netherlands because it's illegal in the UK. But the therapy program is focusing very much on indigenous wisdom and the stories, the old stories of the plants and the practices of the land in the UK.
Fantastic. Could you put the web link, Ros, in the chat? So that'd be fantastic. Sam, did you have any thoughts on that?
So yeah, just to quickly, I think Ros has covered the bases there, but just to quickly say, the psilocybin was synthetic because that is a legal requirement of using it in clinical trials in the UK. It has to be extremely pure, lab made at great expense. And that's the only way you're going to be conducting any kind of medical or scientific research with it. And just to sort of field to another question that's been asked, given the laws in place at this time in the UK, it would be impossible to take someone outside and have a session out there. There's just no way. Doing it inside in a clinical setting is hard and expensive enough. There's enough regulations and stuff to sort of jump through there, but at this time it's impossible. Even in the Netherlands, where psilocybin is legal, doing a proper study there is not even that feasible. So it's a really tough thing to do when you take people out of a clinical sort of retreat held space. But that's a nice thing about this, the synthesis approach, is it's using truffles. So it's using the organic thing. And I do like that. I like the idea, I think with the nature connection thing, the fact that you're kind of ingesting something of the earth is certainly not going to detract from the nature connectedness side of things.
Fantastic, thanks, Sam. And just quickly, Ros, what would you say to people who feel that they want to try this, in a controlled environment? What is the best thing to do to check out synthesis, or what would your recommendation be? Oh, you're on mute, Ros.
I would say synthesis because I know the screening process is really thorough. So there's and there's a whole process behind thinking that you might be ready for it, and then the screening process is really important. So I would say synthesis. That was a really good starting place. I mean, there are other places, but I can't really vouch for any of them.
Okay, and that not that we're encouraging everybody to do that, but the link is there. Brilliant. We have some raised hands. I'd love to go to some live questions. Nusha, do you want to deal with that side of things?
Yes, Ben, you have your raised hand. Would you like to unmute?
Hello, thank you for hi. Thanks for a really interesting talk. I remember hearing you guys speak earlier in the summer and wanted to ask about this because I was interested in the role of silence in the experience with psilocybin, just basing it on personal experience, where actually not having music and being outside, I was very attuned to what I can only describe as the communications I was receiving from the nature objects, whether that was sort of on a vibrational level, basically.
Yeah, no, that's cool. That's cool. I do think so. In the clinical sessions, music is considered very important. Like, it's been described as the third therapist. And it very much, we know from past research that the right music can maximize the chances of people having mystical type peak experiences. And that's really important because they predict the long-term therapeutic gains. So music's absolutely got its place. But, it's interesting. I know Terence McKenna, his way of doing it was like big dose of mushrooms, 5 dry grams, and silence in the pitch black. So you're not giving your brain any input, anything to go on. It's just you and the mushroom. And because obviously music is great, but it's going to, the music is very carefully chosen and crafted. There's not human lyrics in there, at least not ones in your mother tongue. And when you have like lyrical music, it pushes your emotions, it pushes your mind in a certain direction. Whereas if you have more instrumental, worldy music, it doesn't. It leaves a more kind of open canvas. But still, music is going to push you in a certain way, and it's designed to do that. And that's why certain songs are selected. But obviously, when you're in nature, I mean, nature is its own music. The wind in the trees, you've got like, you know, crickets and leaves rustling and frogs and yeah, I think it's an interesting point what you were saying, that in that silence you picked more up, because obviously if you're being bombarded by music, your brain's going to be like, oh, it's going to be fully appreciating and latched onto that. So I think it's an interesting thing what you're saying, that you felt like you're tuning in to more subtle levels of awareness without having music in the picture there.
I think that in the therapy studies, it is a very, very interesting point, but I think that when people are coming, so when people are quite experienced psychedelic users, some experimentation with silence is potentially useful. But for people who are trying psychedelics for the first time, silence is really, it's not for the beginner, essentially. So in the first study we had some silence in the playlist, and some people found it interesting and some people found it just, it's like free fall. And so if you're in nature and that, you know, you're surrounded by nature, then the sounds of nature could be wonderful. But I would say for a lower dose where you could be walking around, the kind of doses we gave people in our study were for many people so high that you wouldn't be able to walk around and enjoy nature. You need to be lying down with, you know, you're going inside. So I think for really high doses where you're in kind of in another dimension anyway, having no music is only for the very experienced psychedelic user. For more medium doses where you can walk around and be in nature, obviously they're not done in the research studies, then yeah, I would say you don't need music. But for the high doses, I'd say pretty essential. I think you could pretty much traumatize yourself by doing a high dose without a playlist. I do think it would be nice to experiment with birdsong though. We thought about playing birdsong, like an electronic track of birdsong recording over the electronic music that we had. I think people would really love that.
Have you got another question there, Nusha?
Yes, David Smartnight, would you like to unmute?
David has been super busy on the chat. It's good to hear your voice.
It's nice as
Hello.
David was at our Embercombe retreat before and had some amazingly helpful insights for us, which we're still using now. Thank you, David, for all that you gave us.
Great, thank you. So yeah, there were a couple of things that I got really curious about. One was around, and I think they all kind of point to the same thing. And one was around, early on, you're talking about nature connection. I think it was Sam talking about nature connection, how it didn't show up as being, and I was like, I wonder if you're really talking about nature connection or just people being in nature as observers. Because to my mind, nature connection is actually when I am nature in the form of a human being, but I'm nature. I'm just as much as the tree or the insects, and so when I'm in that place, then actually I don't need the psychedelics. You know, it's like.
But also, conversely, if I may, this is precisely why psychedelics work in increasing nature connectedness when you don't take them in nature, because you're tuning in to your own nature, because of course we are all nature and we have amnesia of that to varying degrees. So it goes both ways, what you're saying.
Yeah, no, I get it. And I also get why you have to do it in a clinical setting. But the thing about the silence in a clinical setting is that it is the silence of a hospital building. And that's utterly disconnected. And so, of course, it's going to be free fall. Of course, it's going to be really difficult.
Yeah.
And there's just this, So I just wonder to what degree there is the potential to be marrying deep nature connection tools with both the preparation before and the post after. And you've spoken a bit about it, but I think it goes far deeper than what you've spoken to. So that's the wondering within me. It's not necessarily something to answer here and now.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm very much on the wavelength of what you're saying. I think it's incredibly important. I think just because it's so relatively early days with all this, it's very tightly controlled at the moment, like legally, in terms of regulations, in terms of how it and when and where it can be used. But I think as these things are, you know, probably in the next decade, half decade, psilocybin will be rescheduled as a treatment for depression in a therapeutic context. And once that happens, once it's rescheduled, off-label prescriptions will be allowed, and the research, the potential usage of it will open up. It will open up new doors and new opportunities. And I really think that, yes, it will probably start off with being a medical treatment tool, and then it will, or in some parts like the US, you know, Oregon has just legalized psilocybin therapy statewide, which is a big kind of progressive step. So there's the decriminalization movement happening, and there's also the medical scientific thing happening at the same time in different areas. So I think it's a matter of time and societal kind of integration and recognition of these things. But I think it's hugely important, and I'm doing what I can a little bit to try and make at least the case in mainstream scientific circles that this is important, this is worth pursuing and looking at, and yeah, will benefit people and maybe the wider biosphere as well. So yeah, totally with you. Thank you. Yeah.
We've got about 4 minutes left, and I feel as though this could have been a weekend conversation, actually. Just there's so many different questions and things that people would love to talk to you about. But I just wanted, before we go, just for each of you to say just briefly, where is it that you would like this to go? What's your kind of dream of what we might be doing with psychedelics in the future?
I would say, if anyone is interested, so there's an economics professor called Bennett Zellner in America, and he's developing this model called the Pollinator Approach, which is looking at the expansions of psychedelic therapy using an approach of community-based centers run by local communities for local communities, using essentially it's the kind of model where, rather than having a kind of extractive model where you've got a company making psilocybin and the shareholders own it and make lots of money and it gets kind of like a big franchise around it, it's a different model. It's a much more community-led model. It's the kind of model that you can imagine at Embercombe, like Embercombe could become like a pollinator site for it when it's legalized or rescheduled. So I would say I want Bolognese, and I want Bennett Zellner's pollinator model to, that's my dream. That's what I want to see happen. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. And Sam?
I would like to see the potential of psychedelics, particularly psilocybin and the organic psychedelics, their potential explored as nature connecting agents. So right now, nature connection is like a small little side interest of the psychedelic research sphere. I would like to see it take, if not center stage, then a center stage kind of its own, because it's absolutely definitely worthy of that in our time of growing disconnection. You know, these psychedelics on the level of the neuron, they cause neurons to sprout new connections. They cause global brain connectivity increases. They connect us to ourselves, to other people, to the world, to the universe. So we're in this increasingly disconnected time, without getting too over the top or evangelical. We've got these tools here, which on every level of their function are catalysts of connection. So if we use them with care, and if we use them well, and if we use them alongside and with nature connection practices and nature immersion practices, there's huge untapped potential. So I would like to make progress and try and make progress happen with that.
Fantastic. Catalysts of connection and awe therapy are the things that I'm going to take away from tonight. Do you know, it's been wonderful to have both of you. I wish we had hours and hours longer, and all I would ask is that you do come back and do this again, and we will see you hopefully next year for one or perhaps many of the integration weekends, and we'll really look forward to that.
I hope so. Yeah, no, it's been really fun. I love these Q&A things, and it's more like fluid and fun. So yeah, really good.
Let's do it again.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yay.
So
All right.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you so much everyone for coming, and see you again soon. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.